So if you're, well, if you're, I was going to say if you're Atlantic readers, but if you're readers generally, you know everybody on this stage. Elaina Plott, fantastic staff writer, working on an excellent book that will be, I'm sure, the toast of the town here.
I hope so.
Yeah, she hopes so. McKay Coppins, who was obviously written one of the definitive books of the era, of the Trump era, his biography of Mitt Romney. Ann Applebaum, you all know from 5 seconds ago, and Adam Serwer, and you know Adam has done a lot of writing on this subject, and I think he's probably tired of hearing this. I mean, he's written a lot on the judiciary right now, and whether we're a nation of laws or not. But Adam is the person I think who came closest to identifying a spiritual core of the first term when he wrote a piece that later became a book called "The Cruelty is the Point." That was Adam's coinage, and it took off because people really recognized, people really took to it. It seemed intuitively true, and you know, one of the things I would say about the wonderful writers we have on our team is that they have an uncanny, and this is true for everybody on the stage, uncanny ability to translate really complicated ideas and almost inchoate feelings and turn them into articles that help people really gain some coherent understanding of the world we're in. When Ann and I were last out here, I left her with a question that I want her to answer, and then I want others to answer that question. And my question is basically, why weren't institutions prepared for the second round? Do you want to take a shot at it, and then I want to go to Adam on the judiciary?
I think that people are accustomed to their way of life. They are used to doing things the way they've always done them. And the idea that the rules are going to be suddenly completely different is something that almost nobody is ever prepared for. I mean, if you look at what happens when wars break out, you know, you and I have both spent some time in Ukraine. I mean, I was in Ukraine in December, 6 weeks before the war started. And even at that moment, when there were Russian troops on the border, when people knew it was coming, there were still people telling themselves the story that it can't happen, just because it won't happen, because it's too dramatic. And I feel there's an element of that here, you know, that the idea that the traditions and the institutions that we've had for 250 years will suddenly be cut or changed or be different is just something people have trouble dealing with.
Adam, take that answer and place it in the context of the judicial branch, one of the three branches, the judicial branch of government, which seems more active on some of these questions than, let's say, the legislative branch at the moment. Are things holding?
I would say that lawyers in particular are obviously, sticklers for rules. And so many of them did not allow themselves to imagine that Trump would simply not follow the rules or ignore them, as he appears to have done.
You're saying that people become lawyers who, the kind of person assumes that everybody follows lots of rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there was this idea that the courts would be a tremendous impediment because there are all these, our system has a lot of things that are there to slow things down so that nothing is done too capriciously. And unfortunately, the Trump people know that, and they have embarked on a path of essentially ignoring court oversight where they feel like they don't want to follow it. Obviously, the big instance that we all know about is when they were told to turn around a plane that was full of Venezuelans being deported to a gulag in El Salvador, and they appear to have simply refused that order. And I think we will probably see more of that kind of behavior. And I think it sets up, obviously, a conflict with the Supreme Court where they're going to have to decide, well, do we confront the Trump administration by telling them to do something they don't want to do, or do we rewrite the Constitution to accept whatever power grab the Trump administration is engaging in so that we can pretend as though, we still have authority as a court and as an institution?
That's a substantial murmur. that was a...
Yeah, I mean, look, just to give a historical example, the Supreme Court was very involved in essentially writing the 14th Amendment out of the Constitution after Reconstruction, which is something that, should be very familiar to folks here, and, because a lot of that history happened here. But, what they felt they were doing was they were just not opposing public opinion. At the time, America had turned its back on black people. White America had turned its back on black people, and it wasn't going to stand up for their rights, and the courts followed suit. So I think, it's certainly not unprecedented that, a tremendous political change of the winds has influenced the court to acquiesce to what is fundamentally a system of tyranny.
Elaina and McKay, you've both, in recent years, written a lot about the changes in the Republican Party. And I want to start with Elaina and ask you, also as someone from the South, what was the moment when you realized that the Republican Party of Reagan and the Bush family was no longer existed? What was the moment when you realized, oh, we're in a completely different thing? And what was your explanation to yourself for that?
I mean, to some extent, I think I started feeling that from the time he descended the golden escalator, and talking about, Mexican rapists flooding across the border and the reception that got, mocking a disabled reporter, for example, the sort of thing that would just seem unconscionable in past political candidates, but, played rather well with the people I was covering at the time, the people who, were around me when I would travel. And I think what's important, though, in understanding maybe this administration versus the first is that we have to distinguish between the durability of Trump's own desires and the willingness of the people around him to facilitate them. So I think when we talk about, why were institutions maybe not prepared for this? Well, I think because in the first administration you had so many more so-called adults in the room or gatekeepers that, the things that Donald Trump is doing now, those were not sort of, revelatory desires for him, that he said, in his second term, this is a unique thing I want to pursue. The difference is that in a first term, he had people around him who were actually willing just to stonewall him, not say no necessarily, but knew kind of how to get him to forget about it, basically. I would talk to so many senior Republican staffers who Trump would tell them to do something, and they would just, start talking about Robert Mueller and the Mueller investigation, and he'd forget he'd ever asked it. The difference this time around, though, is that not only is the Republican Party more eager to, actually see the realization of those unrealized goals in the first term, the White House and the federal government itself is staffed with people with the power to carry them out, with people who are not at all interested in stonewalling these desires. In fact, hold them themselves.
McKay, you obviously have spent a great deal of time with Mitt Romney, who might count as one of the last Republican dissidents. Tell us when he realized that something was fundamentally different. I mean, this is the man who was the Republican flag bearer in 2012, and all of a sudden, and this is not this is not a metaphor, like no one would eat lunch with him in the Senate dining room.
Right.
Walk us through that and what surprised you the most about the change that came over the Republicans?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Mitt Romney's own story is kind of a tidy way to tell the story of the transmogrification of the Republican Party, right? I mean, like you said, in 2012, he was the standard bearer of the party, the presidential nominee. And he, I think, succumbed to the same temptation a lot of us did early in the Trump era, kind of a piece with what Ann was talking about, which is that early in the Trump era, everybody, or a lot of people believed this was a fluke, this was not gonna last, there's no way that Trump's actually gonna win the nomination. Okay, well, there's no way he's actually gonna win the election. Okay, well, he kind of accidentally fell backwards into the presidency, but the party and the courts, they'll all hold him accountable and they'll stop him. And I think Mitt believed that too, and it's part of why he ran for Senate and kind of came out of retirement in 2018. He said, look, I truly believe, and he literally showed me the pros and cons list he made in trying to decide whether to run for Senate. And he wrote in that list, I truly believe that most Republicans on the Hill want to hold Trump accountable. And I'll go help them. They need somebody to embolden them.
Like a senior statesman.
Yeah, they need somebody there to kind of steer them in the right direction.
And does he acknowledge now that he was...
Oh yeah, he was completely wrong, and he figured it out within weeks of getting to the Senate, right? Like, there was no appetite at all for holding Trump accountable, no appetite at all. He would actually, he started to keep a tally of how many Republican senators would come up to him in private and say, hey, Mitt, love what you're saying, love that you're out there, telling the truth about Trump. I'm with you. Obviously I can't do it because I have to run for re-election, et cetera, et cetera. And he said the thing that drove him craziest about that was that they would look at him expectantly, thinking that he would be grateful, right? That they were privately expressing their agreement.
Right.
And he just realized that the party was not going they were going to acquiesce to Trump.
Fold someone else into this analysis. The person that I think Mitt Romney considers, in a way, his nemesis, J.D. Vance. J.D. Vance, by the way, former Atlantic writer.
Yes.
Noting.
Jeff likes to put it on the homepage, the piece that he wrote every once in a while to kind of...
Where he called Trump a form of cultural heroin. That was in 2016. But Romney said something to you that was striking about J.D. Vance, and I think it stands for a lot about what the Republican dissident movement feels.
I was talking to him when Vance was running for Senate, and kind of in the middle of his MAGA makeover, disavowing every criticism he'd ever made of Trump and turning himself into kind of a MAGA hero. And I asked Mitt, who knew J.D. Vance a little bit, had gotten to know him a little in his earlier iteration, what he made of Vance's transformation. And he said, it would be hard for me to disrespect somebody more than J.D. Vance.
Right.
But
And this is before he read the Signal chat. Yeah.
This is right. That's right. But I think that does speak to how a lot of people, the kind of holdovers from that previous era of the Republican Party, who are just sort of mystified about their fellow Republicans who they thought believed the same things they did, just completely abandoning what they thought were core ideological convictions to go along with Trump.
And the reality now is that there's so much fewer of those types of Republicans even in office currently. So, I mean, covering Congress, you start to see over the years that you have fewer and fewer people coming up to you and say, well, yes, privately, I disagree with what's going on. Not even that really exists anymore.
Yeah,
there's a kind of a purge.
It's true believers.
Not Stalinist, but it's just kind of a self-selection purge, too.
It's true believers, and then it's people like, Marco Rubio, who have, to varying degrees, kind of fully internalized the ideals of Trumpism, and maybe it's real or maybe it's not, but they seem to have fully become what Trump wants them to be.
Right. I want to talk about a very weighty thing. We throw around the term constitutional crisis quite a bit. Adam, when would we know that there is a genuine constitutional crisis at hand?
There is currently an ongoing assault on the rule of law. It almost feels wrong to call it a crisis because it's not like a one moment. It's something that's ongoing. It's going to be ongoing these next 4 years, and we don't know what kind of country is going to come out of it. The system was simply not designed for one of the branches, like Congress, to simply acquiesce to an unelected person, the unelected wealthiest man in the world deciding which parts of the constitutionally created parts of government he wants to destroy. And rather than assert its power, Republicans in Congress have just gone begging hat in hand to Musk, asking him not to destroy their preferred projects. But the system can't work like that. The system works on the branches checking each other, and right now Congress has abdicated its role to check the executive branch.
Is Musk's existence in this system a sign that we're in a constitutional crisis?
Yes, but he's not the only sign. I mean, obviously, if the Trump administration signaling that it will ignore court orders that it does not wish to follow defeats the purpose of having a judiciary to begin with. And what it means is that they're not bound by the law at all. And we're just entering a very dangerous place. And I think McKay and Elaina have talked about Republicans sort of switching ideologically, but one of the reasons for the confidence of the Trumpists is that they believe that all the liberal values that people hold are fundamentally false. People don't really believe them. That's part of one of the core convictions of the sort of anti-wokeness thing, is that they think everybody's faking about believing in things like the Constitution and the rule of law and due process and free speech, and they only believe in them, to gain advantage. And the problem right now is we have a civil society that is not willing to assert those values. We have a lot of people who are supposed to defend those values who are instead cowering in the face of a political phenomenon that it feels like Americans have spent their entire existence learning how to fight, and instead they're not fighting it at all. And that, unfortunately, what's happening, what Elaina and McKay are describing is not just happening to Republicans, it's happening to all American institutions. And the tragedy is that Trump correctly perceived that a lot of these institutions were rotten from the inside out, and that the people who were running them didn't actually believe in the values that they were supposed to uphold.
Or they didn't have the imagination to understand that those values would be so profoundly challenged. I mean, it's a
right. I mean, that is an interesting point. You go through your life as an American just assuming that the First Amendment is the First Amendment. It's been there for a couple of hundred years. It's great. The three co-equal branches of government, great. It's sort of like accepting like the mountains or the sun rises and the sun sets, and there's mountains and lakes, and I mean it's part of our geography. But I want to ask you to follow on what Adam was saying. You've observed and lived in places where there were democratic restraints, and then those restraints came off. Where are we headed? And I'll ask you two the same question. Where are we headed? I mean, believe it or not, we're only, 2 months? We have 3 years and 10 months of this administration. So they're just getting going.
So I think it's important for Americans to understand one piece of perspective. So I did expect an assault on the rule of law. I did expect them to attack journalists. I did expect them to seek to dismantle the civil service. I expected all of that. I didn't expect the speed of it because I didn't have the imagination to understand that Elon Musk could walk into the Treasury, take over the computer system, and then, as Adam says, cut off payments to programs that he doesn't like. And I think that, it's important that Americans understand that what's happening here is happening at a greater speed and with more extremism than it did, for example, in Hungary, or than it did in Turkey, or that it did in Venezuela. So in all those societies, we talked about, it was always boiling the frog, right? There would be little bits of change here and there, and they would manipulate. Viktor Orban was famous for constantly rewriting the Constitution, and he, a little bit of manipulation on the side, or they would steal just a few votes in order to get a constitutional majority. And it was small things over a decade, actually, that gave Orban the power. This is the Prime Minister of Hungary, who's in effect very difficult to challenge now, that gave them that power. And what happened here we've had almost the opposite thing. The frog is being boiled right now. And it turns out that when you do it really fast, that's also very confusing. And people don't see it. And of course, in people's ordinary lives, if you walk around this campus or this city, you don't see any change. And so you don't feel it, unless you're unfortunate enough to work for HHS or, or USAID.
Working on vaccines, yeah.
Or working on vaccines.
Yeah.
We will see those things. The changes will be felt, and the cuts to the changes to vaccination and so on. But the speed has been, I think, is confusing people about the end game. The end game is to have a unitary executive that makes all the decisions, that reduces the power of the other branches to, advisors or spectators, that pushes away at everything from journalists to inspectors general to anybody inside the system whose job it is to produce transparency or accountability, and to eliminate those things so that the executive is untrammeled, so that it does whatever it wants.
Elaina, let me ask you this. Can the speed work against them in the sense that going so fast, they'll make mistakes that will eventually awaken members of Congress to the fact that something's going off the rails?
I actually think it will occur to them first before members of Congress. And the reason I say this is that there's sort of an interesting dichotomy going on with a lot of Trump officials, which is that in addition to their disdain for institutions, they also have this trust in the resilience of them, essentially to protect them against their own mistakes. So for example, Elon Musk and Doge, they operate kind of under the assumption that if they make a mistake, it's very easily undoable. That actually the foundation of American government is sort of proofed in a way against whatever they might do. Of course, that's not true. And there will be a certain point when I think they themselves become surprised, oh, actually cutting a large amount of workers from our intelligence agencies is not so easy as emailing them and saying, hey, can you come back? Because security clearances take years to get. And so it's not as simple as undo. And I think eventually mistakes like that will compound, or second thoughts will come to the point where they say, oh, actually, we didn't even conceive of the expanse of our power.
Right. McKay?
Yeah, I think the X factor in trying to project forward over the next 3 years and 10 months is that there's a key difference between Trump's first term and this term. And one of them is that in the first term, a lot of the people around Trump that were trying to normalize or sand off the rough edges of Trump's agenda. They were trying to convince everybody that this was business as usual, that his opponents were hysterical and alarmist. And I've been talking to Trump allies recently, and I won't give too much away because there will be a story coming to the Atlantic soon. But something that strikes me about a lot of the people around him now is that they are not trying to disguise the radicalism of what they're doing. Mm-hmm. They are very upfront about it. And they're not afraid of terms like constitutional crisis. And I think that when we try to guess or predict what's going to happen, I think we have to factor in the reality that the people working for Trump that are in this administration now know what they're doing is radical. They're not making a secret of it, and they're making a bet that Americans will be fine with it.
In other words, what Adam was saying, or their analysis, agree that they have Adam's analysis, that they believe that the values of the American idea that these are actually not deeply felt.
They
that
were,
people
that
will-
they were a pretense.
They were a
And
pretense for
even
control.
staunch Trump allies, as McKay said, in the first term, would kind of pretend to value those as much as the next person. But
Right.
that
They,
pretense
in the
is gone
first
now.
term, they, quote, acted normally, hired Jim Mattis, Rex Tillerson,
Exactly.
all these kind of people, and now that's done with. We're actually out of time, but I want to ask McKay one more question. McKay, of the people up here, I think you've known Trump the longest. You had a delightful weekend
nice
with him.
distinction.
Yeah, congratulations.
Thank you.
No, it's interesting. I mean, no, he was like, you were like a 12-year-old BuzzFeed reporter.
I was.
And you spent a weird weekend with him at Mar-a-Lago many years ago. What has, just in a few sentences, what has changed about him in your observation of him? Was he always this politically radical?
Well, no, I mean, I think that with a couple specific beliefs aside, he didn't have a lot of core political convictions. One thing I will say that has changed, I don't know, evolved, is that when I spent my weekend at Mar-a-Lago, and you can go read about it, I'm sure you Google McKay Coppins.
It's amazing that there's not a movie yet called Weekend. Or we could call it A Mormon Goes to Mar-a-Lago.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It was, yeah.
Yeah.
I will say the first thing he said to me when we got there was he leaned in and he said, "There are a lot of good-looking women here." And then just walked away. Made me very uncomfortable. No, look, I think that the thing that most struck me about him at the time was how deep his need was for elite approval. And you know, he came off as very needy in a way, and actually the piece that I wrote, this was in 2014, so before he ran for anything, the piece I wrote presented him almost as like a tragic character because he seemed so desperate for respectability and approval from elite quarters. He wanted me to take him seriously. I was, you know, again, a 25-year-old reporter who didn't know anything. He wanted me to take him seriously as a political figure. I think that craving for elite approval has clearly now curdled into a deep hostility toward the establishment in all of its manifestations. And he clearly is no longer trying to get the affection and approval of the establishment because he thinks he now has the power to tear it down brick by brick.
Yeah.
He also is it now.
Yes.
He is the establishment now.
I wish that we can go on, but because I can listen to these folks all day. I want to thank them for coming down, and thank all of you for joining us. You should, in fact, I'm just objectively speaking, subscribe to The Atlantic, obviously. And you should, all of these guys, all of these staff writers at The Atlantic have written magnificent books, and you should buy those books and you should read those books. And I want to thank you on behalf of The Atlantic. Thanks very much for joining us.